Okay.
I see that Ken was more successful with his self-administered haircut than I was today.
Did you cut it today?
Ken also has more to work with, so it's an advantage. So do you want me to go ahead and start talking about the protests?
Yeah. Or wherever you want to start.
So I thought I'd just say about 10 minutes worth of stuff about the protests and then open up to the conversation. I think I was asking Pastor Ken about how many of you guys does he think went to the protests. He's guessing some of you went and some of you haven't. And I don't know quite the nature of the protests in Orange County. The protests in Los Angeles have been getting tons of national coverage, so I've seen a lot of that on the news. But I imagine there's stuff going on in Orange County. In Waco, there's been a few protests, and we've tried to go to them. It's harder to go to a protest in Waco when it's like 100 degrees than it is, like you guys or my friends in San Francisco. So I think about the protests, you can think about tremendous potential benefits to the protests. And if things turn out this way, then the protests will have proven to be one of the most pivotal moments in American history. And then the protests have several things going against them. So let me say what I think could happen, and then what may go in the other direction. The protest may be a genuine shift in our cultural feelings about race, and specifically Black folks. That's to say that we've been working on this for, say, 150 years since emancipation, and we've certainly made progress, but not nearly enough. So one thing would be to say that there is now a broad coalitional movement that has to do with people on the street, corporations, the military, the US government, churches, religious people, and tons of non-Black people who are committed to the idea that Black lives matter in a significant way, that will broadly challenge whole systems in our country. So let me talk about a few things within it, just to give you an example of what we might mean. The first one I talked about in the piece, the defund the police initiative, which suffers from a terrible name. Really, what that is it should be called redistribution. The idea of defunding the police is the idea that we spend a massive amount of our municipal dollars on police officers, just like we spend a ton of our state and federal money on prisons. I think they're talking, I think I read, it was either San Francisco or LA I was reading, it was like, what is it, $5 billion budget for police or something like that. It's a massive budget. And the idea is that we need to stop spending money on police officers and prisons and start asking ourselves why we have all those people in prisons, and why do we think we need so much police, and why is the net result of all that policing and imprisonment mostly brown and Black people. So especially since a large number of people in prison are in prison for crimes or issues related to things like poverty or systemic injustice. So if we shift the money from prisons and police there, to those kinds of services, then we're just going to need the police and we're going to need prisons less. And then the secondary set of questions will be, well, why do we have this inequality to begin with? So the defund the police thing is a local initiative, largely by way of kind of local communities thinking, how can we reimagine policing? If we reimagine policing, where would we shift those funds in our use of public monies? And then the third thing would be, why do we have poverty in the first place? So if you follow the dominoes along those lines, then you could have a massive reshifting in terms of how we think about this. Another level at which the protests are happening that hasn't happened in the past are at the level of culture that this is now influencing. there's a really interesting debate within the NBA, which is I think 85% African American, about whether the NBA should start up again. Initially, that was a conversation about safety conditions related to COVID, but increasingly it has been a decision about whether African Americans should participate in a sport that would detract from a conversation about the welfare of African Americans in this country. That is a hugely important thing, because it's been more often the case that celebrity status African Americans have not often weighed in on issues of injustice facing their own people, right? And the most famous example of this in the NBA, of course, is Michael Jordan. When he was asked to support a Black non-Republican, that is Democratic senatorial candidate for the U.S. Senate, against the very, pretty clearly racist Jesse Helms. He refused to get in, because, he said, quote unquote, money's green, and even Republicans buy Jordans. So the fact that NBA players are now wondering whether if they play in the, NBA playoffs and pursue their championship or playoff dreams, is that they're beginning to see that as possibly diametrically opposed to the welfare of their own people. This is important because celebrity and fame and wealth have often taken some minoritized people out of the conversation insofar as it no longer affects them. So that sports figures are now saying things like, well, maybe I won't play, which would come at not only substantial cost to them as athletes and, well-paid celebrities, but it would come at significant cost to the larger sports culture, which they deeply rely on. So that would be another thing, right? So that's another huge thing. A third thing that you could point to is the sources of change happening in the democracy right now. One of the chief claims about democratic socialism, right? Most people think about democratic socialism, they think about the second word socialism. What they don't think about oftentimes is what democratic socialists are most interested in. This is people like Bernie Sanders, but say even more radical than that, is that the primary problem with inequality isn't simply the suffering it creates, but more so that it locks into the very political structure of that inequality. Why? Because it blocks people out from their basic life as citizens. Once you have a situation in which poor people are consistently discouraged or disabled or just illegally blocked out of democratic processes, then you create a perpetual system of injustice. It can't change. But one of the things that's really interesting, and what that's created over decades is largely a top-down democratic system, right? And there's ways in which even what we're looking at right now, like, it's very possible that Trump will be reelected just because of the electoral system, which is, anti-populist in its nature. But what you're seeing on the street is people largely from grassroots places, from bottom up, forcing reconsiderations of what democratic life requires and demands. And this is hugely important because, of course, the kind of standard legitimate ways in which we address issues of injustice, they just haven't worked. They're too entrenched. They either are prejudicial by proxy or they're defensive by proxy. Prejudicial by proxy means you're not explicitly racist against Black people or, say, Asian Americans. You are by proxy for some other reason. But it's also the case that legally we're defending systems of injustice by proxy, right? Like, for example, the current debate about the kneeling at the flag thing. Notice how the defense of the people who say you shouldn't kneel when people sing the anthem, they say, well, that's an injustice against the flag. But notice that's just a proxy defense of racism. Because you try to shift the conversation, shift the object of concern in a way that largely hijacks the conversation. So the fact that people are now getting in the street, what they're saying is we no longer trust those systems to speak for us. And notice it's a lot of non-Black people. So everyone's saying this system doesn't seem to work for anyone. And And so we're gonna change the way democracy works. A hugely important moment for democracy. And the fourth thing, briefly, is that not only are non-Black people leading the charge in many ways here, but Christians are fully engaged. There's lots and lots of Christians, a lot of evangelicals, a lot of mainline Protestants and Catholics are involved in this conversation. There isn't, I mean, there's certainly a huge swath of white evangelicals, Trump's base, and this kind of thing that are, I watch Fox News as a discipline, and if you watch Fox News, it's all about it's all about riots and stuff like this. But for the kind of mainline evangelicals, mostly in cities or urban areas, they're fully interested in this protest. They're not put off by it. They don't see it as threatening to them. They see it as continuous with their Christianity, and that's a huge thing. So those are four ways that the protest can go really well, right? That they can mark a genuine shift. Here's four ways it may not go well. One, probably the most likely is that in about 2 or 3 weeks, it's nothing, right? The world just starts up again. We start watching sports. We realize we're just too comfortable in our systems of inequality, and the protests die out largely by attrition. That's very likely. Another way that the protests die out is they become increasingly violent and anarchist. What's the cost there? Well, of course, the violence itself is a huge cost. But think about the defund the police initiative. If the defund the police initiative is paired with anarchist violence, then of course Trump will appropriate that to justify a law and order intervention. And it will no longer be a conversation about inequality. It will become a question about violence and not violence. And that's the nature of protest, right? Protest is not the same as democratic organizing. Protest is, it's what King called rage spoken in a different kind of way. So whether the protest movement can become, a type of organized set of commitments to change vis-a-vis defund the police or what have you, will largely depend on whether it can resist evolving into forms of violence. And that's the nature of any kind of democratic action that is engaged mostly around the question of rage. Right. That's to say, if there are reasons for violence, you can't think of a better reason for violence than the continuous death of Black people. My pastor, I thought, put it really well the other day. He's a white dude, and he said in a sermon, he said, what white Christians who perpetuated slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, et cetera, we need to realize is that it's an act of God's grace that mostly what Black people want is equality, not something more. That's a really good way of putting it. That's to say, if this devolves into violence, there's a really good reason for this violence. I'm committed to nonviolence. I don't think any violence is justified, but if there ever was. So if it can retain its structure of nonviolent, democratic, kind of pro-organizational movement, then there's real possibilities. But it's also very possible at some point people will get tired of what they consider no change and violence will happen. The other things that can happen, and this is a really big question, is whether the protests, which in my mind are primarily about questions of inequality and the use of race to justify the inequality, whether instead of attacking the inequality, which to me is the baseline issue, the outcome of the protests will be further commitment to the notion of racial identity. In other words, what people will think is the logical conclusion of George Floyd's death is the proliferation, the affirmation, establishment, defense of racial identity as such, right? So I heard a version of this in my Bible study the other night when an Asian American woman said, well, what George Floyd has really made me think about is I really need to get more in touch with my Asian American identity. To me, that is about half of what we need. But if it doesn't get past there to ask, why did we come up with the idea of racial identity in the first place, then it will be stuck. And my guess is it's more likely to go there. because we can look at the George Floyd's death as, on the one hand, a moment about Black death and this Black man's suffering and the history of Black suffering. And then it's possible that that's all it becomes about. And on the other side of that, the evil of whiteness, right? And then for us Asian American, people who are Asian Americans, I know not all of you are, but for Asian Americans, it becomes this battle zone about where we fit on the kind of the totality of anti-Black violence and the evil of whiteness, right? And two places, just to give you an example that this is playing out among Asian Americans, is two places. One, I think some of you guys have probably heard of the Yellow Power for Black Lives Matter movement. It's a little t-shirt that some people wore into the protest. This has come under quite a bit of controversy, namely by people who have said that it's too easy for Asian Americans to claim that because in doing so, they seem to forget their own complicity in racism. So it's a kind of virtue signaling to wear a shirt like that. So automatically, it no longer becomes about inequality faced by all peoples using the category of race. It becomes primarily about Black suffering and Black identity. And the question of inequality across races gets evacuated as a concern. It just no longer matters. There's another version of this I've been reading in among, there's a certain ministry, I won't name it, but there was a huge debate within the Asian American community about Hmong Americans. Why is this important? Because one of the police officers who helped kill George Floyd was Hmong. And so some Asian Americans have said, well, the fact that he helped kill George Floyd just shows you the complicity of all of us Asian Americans, right? Because Hmong are part of us Asian Americans. But some Hmong people, I think very rightly, have said, what do you mean we? You've never included us in your group. We are certainly not the model minorities. We're certainly not like East Asians. In fact, the history of the Hmong is a history of oppression goes back to Asia. The Vietnamese oppressed them, the Chinese oppressed them, the Cambodians oppressed them, the Laotians. And so the very fact that you now try to claim a solidarity with us, or even by kind of distancing us within Asian American, belies the fact, right? So once it becomes about racial identity, this infighting is a natural occurrence. And the great tragedy here is that's the very nature of race. That's what race was created for. It was created for infighting to protect itself against the exploitation for which the race category was created. So if you have more questions about that, do ask me. So that's just to say the protest could go well for the reasons I said and have those kinds of effects. It could devolve into violence. It can devolve into boredom and not come to anything. Or the people will take the primary meaning of the protest to be about affirming racial identity. And to me, this is just going to get us to the same place we've been probably in the anti-racist argument probably for about 50 years after kind of late 60s. So, okay. Hopefully that's clear, but what questions or kind of what are you guys thinking about all this stuff?
I guess one question that I had was, what do you see in this movement currently that is different from, for example, 5 years ago, or I don't actually know the number, when like Black Lives Matter first came onto the scene? Is there anything different between then and now that you see?
Yeah, I think people called it BLM 1, this is BLM 2. I think COVID has a lot to do with it. So the combination of COVID and what COVID represents, I think people probably intuitively get that the protests are as much about anti-Black racism as it is about Donald Trump. And I think people generally see Trump as, and COVID synonymously. So the big difference is the political moment, right? We found America at a point of its greatest frustrations in terms of government, conservative government, white racism, the use of white racism to justify systems of inequality, Trump's continuous race baiting. So you have that, and you have COVID conditions, which means, these are very practical conditions. People are locked up. They haven't been able to do anything. There haven't been ways to kind of get out to express. So you have it's like this kind of you know, perfect storm of realities coming together. And my other guess is that the another major difference between this Black Lives Matter and the first one is that we've now apparently needed a second one, because the first one came largely to no avail. I mean, in fact, it's not at all clear whether this one's come to any avail. I have no idea what it's like to be a police officer. And if you read my piece, I said, yeah, it's very possible what we're doing here is scapegoating police officers. In fact, I'm sure that's what we're doing. We're scapegoating white police officers because we've tasked them with the impossible job of policing people living in extreme poverty. And we know what happens to our hearts when we're asked to participate in those forms of cruelty over time. So it's very easy to escape the police officers. The situation in Atlanta that happened just this weekend is astronomical. I mean, it's extraordinary for the simple reason that this is happening at the same time people are asking whether we should defund the police. So if I'm a police officer, I'm thinking I'm going to stay as far away from this stuff as possible. And yet here we are with another situation. I mean, it just seems to happen all the time. The other thing I want to say is the very nature of this death, George Floyd's death. I mean, you sat there and watched someone die. It wasn't a gunshot, right? You remember the man in Chicago a few years ago who shot, he was running in, and they show him dying in the street. It's in the middle of the night. It's a bunch of cars are there. It's a gunshot, right? So gunshots, it's harder to kind of figure out what's happening. This guy's like suffocating right in front of us. You know, and Charles Barkley, I thought, said it best. He's like, I'd never seen a human being die in front of me. And because of our nature with kind of virtual space, it was like we were there. So I'm guessing those are the dynamics that lead to this. You may be asking also the question, how will this be different than BLM 1, as in what change will actually come out of it? That's why I said it's very possible the first scenario I talked about, where all these positive things come, but it's also very possible 5 years from now we'll be talking about BLM 3. Right, this one either fizzles out or it becomes violent. So we don't know. This is. I mean, you guys are living in kind of amazing political time. I mean, anyone living in a Trump presidency is living in extraordinary political times. But this particular moment, again, in continuity with the Trump presidency, is unlike anything I've seen. So.
And then, sorry to ask another question. So I'm actually based in DC, and I'm 10 minutes from the White House. And so all of that chaos, I've been to the protests, all of that, I feel that as well. I think kind of just my personal experience going to these protests has been, and I guess I don't really understand historically, but I don't see a specific, I see the signs for defund the police, right? And I agree, I don't think that's actually what we're calling for. I guess for me, when I think kind of historically to protests, I think of things like the ERA, right? The women's right to vote. There isn't as clear of a call as I see in this. And I think it is very much dependent on like local policy as opposed to national policy. I can only imagine what could happen from a national standpoint is funding, which I don't really know where police funding comes from right now. That could be controlled at a federal level. But I guess for me, it's a little bit harder to understand what is the call that we're trying to stand behind. And I think the way that I've actually witnessed these protests and kind of decided to attend these protests as is like kind of an ear to listen to the emotion, more so than this is the political stance that I'm taking.
What's it like to be in the DC protests right now? Is it pretty emotional?
I think it's yeah, I think it's a lot of different emotions coming back. I think what you were saying of, right, like I stood at the fence in front of the White House where I saw the National Guard, and you could clearly tell that no one wanted to be there. like the National Guard doesn't want to be there. The people protesting don't want to be there. I think a lot of the inflammatory remarks aren't coming from people of color that I see there. I mean, yeah, it's kind of just a lot to take in. Like last week I had the Blackhawks flying over. I had 5 Blackhawks over my apartment, right? Things
Wow.
like that. And so it's kind of just a lot. But I think, yeah, I guess my point kind of just being like, so much of this is controlled at a local level, and there's not like, we can't pass the Equal Rights Amendment, right, to now justify women's right to vote. There's no amendment that I can imagine at a policy level to say racism is now gone. And I don't know if that's me trying to find a institutional fix to these types of things, or if there's something different to be done. And then I guess more specifically, would hope that our conversation go towards what is Christ Kaleidoscope in our local community meant to be doing as well. And
Yeah,
I do think that temptation,
no, go ahead, go ahead.
I think the temptation that you're talking about, we turn this into a moment of self-reflection, is probably the biggest temptation for our church.
Right.
And just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you don't know why you're out there, you just want to be out there because you sense the reasons for rage and you feel it at some distant level. It's really good to be out there. I mean, I think that's one of the great things about protests. People are out there for all kinds of reasons, and including they don't know why. You know, we went out there with our kids, and you know, you kind of hear these speeches, and you got this thing going, but you're not quite sure why you're there. You know, you need to be there, kind of in solidarity with people who are suffering, and at some level, you feel the outrage. I don't know the status of the DC conversation on where it's hooking into policy, say. But in some zones, like I've been doing this research in San Francisco, so I follow the San Francisco stuff pretty closely, and they actually have a set of policies they've given that have been thought out before the protests, and now they can give it to the mayor and the city council, and the mayor and the city council have committed to defunding at some level of the police. Minneapolis has talked about the same thing. And what's great about it is that can happen, or the police just recognize we better say something, right? Even Trump has the executive order, right? Waco, of all places, completely unprompted, Waco said, here's what we're planning to do. Now, are they trying to hijack and appropriate the conversation and blunt it? Of course. And will be up to the organizers of protests to move from protest to actual organization to push the conversation forward, for sure. I think that's what we hope happens. I think historically, say the last 3 decades of these kinds of things, it won't go that far. And then I think your point about, are we going to end racism with it? To me, the conversation has to be about the question of inequality that uses race and race categories and racism for the justification of that inequality. That's what the conversation has to be about. It cannot be about something, it can't simply be about anti-Black racism. Partly because that's so amorphous, as you're saying, it's kind of hard to know what that would mean to address that. In some ways, the Black Lives Movement alone has taken us a long way in that, simply by people saying, over and over again that Black Lives Matter, when apparently it didn't for a lot of us. But if we can hook it on to these systemic issues, and then the dominoes begin to fall, then we can have a reconsideration of why we live the way we do. So that's, I think, the hope. I don't know. I think I'm as skeptical as anyone that we may not get there. In fact, it's likely we won't. But I think that's where you might consider going out and seeing what you can do to support it. I understand that Orange County no longer requires people to wear masks. It folded under enormous local pressure, I heard.
John, do you think that there would, as you said, there's different responses across the country, right, to these protests and these demands. Given that racism is, as you said, at the retreat, kind of permeates American society all throughout, that there are different conversations happening in different cities, do you think maybe there's like, I don't know, like maybe cracks in the system where like there's certain cities, certain states that, well, I don't want to say like, you know, opt out of that system of exploitation, but that, you know, perhaps it's, you know, the dynamics are different. I'm just curious as to how you think about that.
Yeah, and that's why the kind of the ground level democratic flavor of the thing really matters, right? So where people are able to kind of effectuate those systems where they have more intimate relationships with them. Let's say that you live in a small municipality, and the police are people you know, or it has a certain kind of history. So there's certainly, I mean, the whole system, remember, any system of injustice is terribly unnatural. So it needs to be maintained in all these kinds of ways. And so the kind of reproduction of systems of hegemony is also what makes them deeply vulnerable, right? That's why, Foucault's whole thing about power was, on the one hand, power is everywhere, but that also means we have more power than we claim most of the time. I think that's the heart of kind of radical democratic thought. We just don't claim it because we think somewhere out there, right, the man's in charge. Well, that's partly true, and it's partly we acquiesce, we abdicate to it. That's why the kind of grassroots nature of this is really important, because it is shifting what we mean by democratic life, right? We live in a pale democracy most of the time, a democracy run by representatives rather than direct action. So this is not that. So it's the possibility for change. So I would hope the answer would be yes, Hamilton, and those would be the openings. It's also the case that there will be different locales where there's strongholds, and it'll be much harder. Well, I think it's hard everywhere, but there may be places where it's less hard. Like I haven't figured out with Waco, like, Waco 100 years ago lynched some kid named Jesse Washington and dragged his body down the street, what became known as the Waco Horror. For years and years, they wouldn't talk about it. No one would talk about this poor kid's lynching. And now the city's actually decided to build a monument to his to the lynching. That's a small thing, but for our city, that's a big thing, right? So there are fissures, and people go on to places like New Orleans and say, we don't want this statue anymore. And generals, right? People by nature who are pretty conservative, saying we need to rename the bases. So I would hope that we're at a tipping point.
Jonathan, one of my cousins, I have several cousins that live in DC too, and they told me about this thing called the AND campaign. It's a Christian movement that's like non-partisan to address social issues. Have you heard of it?
No, what's it called?
The AND campaign. I messaged it to you, like AND.
Okay.
And I think it's supposed, I haven't read too much into it, but it's supposed to be something similar to like the Catholic worker movement, or just addressing the issues that are at hand from primarily just non-partisan way.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that, for churches like Christ Kaleidoscope, that's trying to figure out a way into this and what their presence would look like. Something like that would be really helpful, right? And Catholic Worker is a really great example. I mean, I was just reading in the book, in Common Prayer, the prayer book this morning, that this is the anniversary of a bunch of Catholic workers refusing to participate in these kind of military drills that are going on, like 100 years ago. These are people who they don't have a dog in the fight, in that they think this is a partisan issue. To them, this is just an issue of kind of caring and loving neighbors. And so they go into it. They don't have to feel like, you don't have to feel like you're going to be co-opted to something. That's the nature of the protest. It's so diffuse. There's so many people there for so many different reasons. But they're gathered in this kind of collective anger, rage, or disappointment, or mourning. So like in the Waco protests, I don't know about the protests you guys have been to, but in the Waco protests, there's like tons of Christians and Christians speaking out. And of course, a lot of the African Americans of course, a lot of social life in African American history has been the Black church. So these folks readily talk about Jesus. So I think there's all kinds of ways that Christians can kind of find their way into this, and whether they take the meaning of what they're doing from an and like movement, or they kind of articulate their own. This is what we're doing. You guys can be there, and like where Christ, the church in San Francisco, they went with a bunch of other churches. That's how they went together. So they went with other churches. You guys can go there. You can say you're part of Black Lives Matter, or you can have your shirt that says Christ Kaleidoscope. That's why we're here, and let that speak for you guys. But I think you find your meaning in the kind of in the midst of things. I don't at all think of myself as like a protest leader. I don't think that for me that's the primary nexus of my engagement with these issues. But I also don't want to say I'm somehow, because I write about it, I can have the luxury of just sitting at home. So I think there's all kinds of ways you guys can be a part of it. But I also want to say that you don't have to. That doesn't have to be the primary articulation of witness or faithfulness for Christ's Kaleidoscope. I don't think there's a question whether you can be involved or not in the fight against racism or injustice. That's obvious. There's all kinds of ways to participate in this. The thing I think most of us most readily need to do is check our privilege, check the ways we benefit from it, check our own racism, our own complicities, and then see ways that we can be involved. And for, as I wrote about in the piece, for some people, it's, participating in a school for underprivileged kids. And I know you guys do different types of work in the community. So you guys, that could be, you could feel like that's what God has me doing. But for some of you, for the very reason that you work with those kids and you see the kind of systems they're crushed by, you may feel like, hey, I want to get in the street because, I'm particularly attuned, not like I'm Black, but I see what these kids go through. So that can be, you guys have, as we've talked about a lot, you guys have a lot of people in the legal system, not necessarily criminal justice, but you could come at it from that angle. So there's all kinds of things you guys can be doing. Protest is one of them. Protest will die out at some point. The question is, what is Christ Kaleidoscope's ongoing participation in these processes? You may decide as part of that ongoing thing, let's go to a protest, at least a handful of us. And, maybe the only thing we'll do there is pray silently. Or Anthony, as you were saying, sit there and be with other people. Or maybe you will find yourself raging, so who knows?
I have a question about communicating with people that in our lives that disagree, or I guess specifically talking about conservative evangelical Christians that are Trump supporting, and they're people that we know or love or both. And it just feels like we cannot see eye to eye. That it is so far, that our view of what's happening in the world is so far from what they think, and what they think is so far from what I think. How do you talk to them, I guess? Because it feels like, specifically like my parents, like it feels like whenever I talk with them, that I guess they always just like bounce it back to me. Like I'll say like, Mom, you don't really know everything that's going on. Like you haven't been educated in some of these things. And then she'll just say it right back. And I don't really know like how to have a conversation when that's the only thing that, I don't know, that they just, there's like no critical thinking, I guess. And that's really frustrating. But then I also don't want to be like, oh, it's because you're not smart enough, or, how do you not insult their intelligence, but also try to communicate with them in an effective way? It was a long-winded question, but yeah.
No, it's a good question. I mean, fortunately we have Christians have the resources for thinking about questions like that, because those are the questions that are usually tied to people who want to be weary of pride, lack of compassion, judgment, self-righteousness, which, you know, there's no self-righteousness that like people who are politically engaged. I mean, if you want to see an articulation of self-righteousness, you know, join Twitter, where most people think that the upshot of anti-racism is to shout people down. So yeah, so we don't want to be in a Twitter battle, especially with our parents. But I also don't want to say that we should say, well, take some opinion like, well, it's, you know, their position is as valid as ours. Of course they think it is. And of course we think our position is more valid. But I think it's okay for Christians to some say, you know, excusing a kind of false modesty to say, I believe what this person believes is wrong, and that they are participating insofar as they justify these things and become apologists for it, that what they're saying is wrong. That doesn't mean we have to say that to them, right? Truth is something people are, I mean, all of us are capable of extraordinary levels of self-deception. How you make someone aware of their self-deception, of course, is very tricky business. It's just like when someone tries to make us aware of our self-deception, which very well your mom may think she's doing, right? And she's doing it not because she thinks she's morally superior. She's doing it because you're her daughter and she cares about what you think and how you live your life and the consequences of it, right? So I think you can simultaneously think someone's like really wrong, and that they're wrong, like really wrong, as in wrong on the wrong side of God, without also thinking that we're in a position to judge them or condemn them. And I think then how you articulate, you know, how I talk to my mom or how any of us talk to, you know, so-and-so is issues of really kind of standard forms of practical reason. I mean, we just need to always be aware of our forms of self-righteousness. Our, you know, especially liberal-minded people are so self-righteous, so so intolerant, right? I was talking to someone from, I've been interviewing tons of people for this thing, and by far the most intolerant people are the really left-wing people. They're sure that they know better than everyone, they're smarter than everyone else is a racist, homophobe, this, that, and the other. Maybe, very possible, very possibly I am. But just the level of intolerance, it's both sides, right? I mean, I watch CNN and Fox, not because I think they have equal amounts of truth. I really don't think Fox is that interested in truth at the moment, but partly to remind myself that CNN is just full of self-righteousness too. Insofar as I see on CNN, they consistently make it about a racial identity question. They consistently, try to divert the questions of political economic justice. So you see it all around, and I think with our loved ones, we need to treat them like loved ones. So there may be a time, Serena, when you say to your mom, I think you're really wrong. And I think in being wrong, I think you're, some version of you're on the wrong side of history. And I say that with great humility, but I just want you to know that it's important for you to think about that. Like I'm doing this interview with these interviews with a bunch of people from Mississippi. These people are like 80 years old. And they grew up in the Mississippi South, and they're extraordinary lives. But a lot of them were really racist. And I was talking to this gentleman, and it's pretty clear he was racist. And so he said in an interview, like, well, I don't want you to quote me because I'm going to sound racist. I mean, because he admitted he was racist at one point. And I said, you know what, Mr. I won't tell you his last name. I said, Mr. whatever. History may smile more kindly on you by admitting it, because from a certain perspective, people are just going to look at you and think you were obviously racist, and what was worse, you didn't even think you were. It might be better just to say I was racist at some point in my life, like a lot of us are, and thank God I'm not anymore. So there are ways in which grace is grace, not saying something, and sometimes truth is grace. they go together for Jesus. And it's sometimes important for us to speak truth, especially if the person's a Christian. So, yeah. I mean, you're a wise person, and the people who ask the question you're asking, Serena, are not the people I worry about. It's the people who don't ask that question. Right? They just know what they need to say, and they just say it without any type of consideration. Those are the people you worry about. But people who like wring their hands, should I say something? You could trust those people. You know, even if things go wrong, that's the nature of family or friendship, that you have a lifetime to figure it out. But sometimes you do need to say something.
Thank you. Yeah, I just feel like I know that there was no easy answer, and it's just frustrating. But yeah, I know that there's probably a lot of people in the same boat. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say something on the same thing that kind of Serena was saying.
Luke, I didn't recognize you with your beard.
Oh, really? Did
Yeah.
I not have one before? I've been having this conversation a lot. I mean, I'm all my family is conservative white people, and a lot of my friends. And so it's been a lot of arguing, and I was just like butting heads with people constantly. And after like conversation like 25, like at 1 a.m. arguing with my dad, I found that the one thing that kind of got through to him was to instead of going into all the nitty gritty of like these are the systems and like this is the history and like this is whose fault it is and stuff like that, which are all true. Uh, I just at one time I was like, are you happy with the way America's going? You know, like I think that conservatives have an equal amount of a feeling that like something's wrong, you know? And I was like, Dad, you watched that video. Like, do you think that that's right? Like, do you think that we are going the right direction? And he was like, no. I was like, okay, well then like we need to change something. And it was weird. It's like something broke in him at that point where he was like, yeah, we need to make a change. And so even if we don't agree on all of the why and the how, it's like saying like, okay, like we need to do something to rectify the racial injustice that's happened. Like whether or not we agree with whose fault it is or how.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we non-conservative, say Republican Fox News people can think is that if people don't agree with us, they must be racist, right? They must be, if they don't go with our opinion, our way of thinking about anti-racism, then they must just be, you know, racist. I think that when you watch that video, there's a kind of common humanity. It's sickening. And I think what Luke is saying is connect with that. And the kind of common cause may blur some of the usual dividing lines, and kind of get us in a place at least we can share, if only for a moment. And that's really important, right? Because that's in a sense what's galvanized all these folks, even in the protests, is they don't all share the same view of race, right? Like my paper, that piece I published it's pretty controversial because you know, a certain kind of Black identity is not going to like that kind of argument. But there are ways that we can find common cause. I mean, everyone agrees that four police officers standing on a man for 9 minutes and killing him is wrong. All of us agree that slavery was a terrible thing in this country's history. Right? All of us think that racism is bad. What we disagree on is on the scope of racism, the nature, its practices and operations. But there seems to me to be enough agreement, right? That's why it's really important that these conservative generals, stood and said, you know, at the end of the day, I see the humanity of the Black men and women who serve under me, and the U.S. military could not exist without them. So there are these kind of commonalities that we can tap into. I think the great thing about the protests is you don't have to be there to be divisive. I mean, you could even imagine a conversation. I don't think you're in the same city as your dad, Luke, but you could even imagine a conversation if you were, and you say, you know, we both agree that dude's death was wrong. And whatever we think, whether we agree with each other or whether we agree with the other protesters, let's find a way to mark that. Let's find a way to say that together. And I think people want something like that. I don't think people want to be divided by these ways. Well, some people do, I guess, but most people do.
Hey, John. So going back to what you said earlier about defunding the police, it should really be named redistribution of taxpayer dollars. So
Yeah.
isn't that something we should advocate for because it is combating, you know, the inequality that racial identity was created to perpetuate?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But, you know, redistribution is going to be a tough row for most of us because most of us are upper middle class and we benefit from the systems of inequality. But let's say we're willing to say, you know what, I may benefit, but that's not just. If enough people begin to say redistribution needs to happen, then we can do that. A lot of nations, a lot of European nations, a lot of Eastern countries in Asia have very different distributive systems. We just happen to be in one that, you know, the police in our country are deeply tied to histories of racism, right? Police are deeply tied to carceral systems, deeply tied to slavery, guns in America, right? One of the primary reasons Second Amendment has such gravity in our country is because the reason a lot of people wanted Second Amendment rights was to protect themselves from their slaves. So if we can begin to see where these systems line up in these kind of evil consequences, deeply harmful, then we should make arguments for redistribution. We just will have to see we have to be willing to see how far that line goes, because it will mean fundamental changes in our society. People, of course, when they hear defund the police, the first thing they think is, am I going to be safe? What the distribution people are saying is that's the wrong question. The question is, why do you think you need the police to be safe? Why do people commit crimes, right? Are criminals like really evil people out there? You know, so I think those are the things. I don't know. What do you think, Janet? You're a lawyer.
I'm all for redistribution. That's why I was an Andrew Yang fan.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have read any of Thomas Piketty's massive volumes, Capital in the 20th Century and then Capital and Ideology. They're considered like, you know, magnum opuses in kind of contemporary economic theory, left-leaning. He's an economist in France. It's all like empirical data, all of his arguments. But he says, if you look at the way economic systems are set up, they're entirely proprietary. What he means is that economic systems are entirely about property. And about possessing property and making money off of property and keeping other people off your property. That means the entire criminal justice system is set up to protect those proprietary systems, right? So the divisions against equal distribution are the very basis of injustice in our society. So that's why I say if we're going to ask the questions of redistribution, that rabbit hole is going to go all the way down in our society. And that's the question. That's why it's possible that the conversation about the police can end up being the conversation of our lifetime. I don't think it'll go there, but that's the potential for the conversation. Right. That's what an Andrew Yang was pressing. It's my guess is that's what Biden will be. You know, Biden winning the election over Trump will be either 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back. I don't know. But he's just not radical enough to kind of press those kinds of questions. But he will, hopefully.
You think we won't get there because you think people will just get stuck on race? Okay.
No, I think Biden will be if Biden wins, but this is not Biden's game, right? That's not his politics. He's been a centrist his whole life. Centrist Democrats are same as centrist Republicans. They're overwhelmingly interested in the kind of neoliberal forms of government. I mean, Obama was a liberal progressive at one point in his life, but by the time he became president, he was squarely committed to the constitution of a neoliberal political economic state. That's what Clinton did too. That's why Clinton doubled down on the Reaganian, economic government, and he spread the carceral system. Right, he passed the largest, most sweeping criminal legislation in American history. Those things go together. So I don't think Biden's going to do that. I think we're going to elect Biden. Well, there's two scenarios. The protests really take over American life, and we swing massively to the left, and we have Biden and some lefter vice president, and we enact real left-leaning reforms. Most likely what will happen is this stuff will die down by November. We'll count Biden's election as victory in and of itself. And Biden will be a centrist government. In other words, he'll reestablish the legitimacy of the neoliberal politics of our order. He won't fundamentally challenge them. That's one thing that's really great about Trump. As terrible as he is, he illumines the racism of our system, right? He illumines the inequality because he fixates on them and he gets energy from them. My guess is that Biden will take us in the other direction. He'll make all that seem really legitimate, really sensible. It will be the middle road that makes us think it's not that bad, insofar as what we have is not Trump. I think that's the worry most people have that are Yanksters or Warren people, Bernie people.
That just seems really sad when, and I think I agree with you that we won't go that far as we want to, like this will die down again, and then, we'll just be happy that Biden got elected. And I was sharing with my small group, like, I still remember the Rodney King beatings and the riots that happened. And I remember as a little girl thinking, like, okay, like at least now people see, the evil that these policemen did, and now there's going to be like real change. And then 30 years later, and like all these Black deaths later, it seems like nothing's changed. If anything, it's gotten worse. And I was sharing with Ken, like, kind of my anger at, maybe it's displaced anger, but I kind of blame the church for not, like, seeming like they didn't do anything about it. Like, we didn't do anything about it. And I just, like, how can we make sure it doesn't happen, that we just think, okay, like now this is going to change, and then we just go back to normal come November.
So let me say a couple of things. Well, let me say three things. The first thing is, it's amazing you were thinking that when you were a kid, when the riots were going on. I think I was thinking of, like, how can I get on my Atari system? So you said another worry of mine, right? Which is that the George Floyd thing will largely become about Black identity. The political expression of that is what we're seeing right now, an uptick in a call for the vice president nominee to be a Black woman, right? And in other words, that the elevation of a Black woman to the vice president will be the symbol that it serves as the catharsis for the whole thing, making it seem like the protests were protests about racial and gendered identity rather than about the root causes of inequality below it. That's what I said I was worried about. That's, I think, the most likely political route. Like, if you look at all the kinds of scenarios, since the riots and the protests have started, all the Black women have been elevated to the top second spot, right? That's what my guess is what happens. And to me, that's sad. In some ways, it's obviously a victory. You have a woman, you have a black woman. But on the other hand, if that's where all this energy goes and it doesn't go to these fundamental questions, then we'll have lost an opportunity. But the real question is exactly what you said for the church. The church is the number one culprit in all of this, right? It dominates politically, numerically, economically, culturally, institutionally. It always has. And so it's not simply that the election of 2016 can be laid at the feet of the church. 81% of white evangelicals voted for that guy, gave him the office. It's not simply that, but that follows an absolute history of exactly that same thing. Like we can't ever forget that in this brilliant book, there's a brilliant book you might read called Hitler's Willing Executioners. The primary people that enabled Hitler were white Protestant Lutherans, right? Which is the vast majority of the German populace. The people who not only allowed but defended and theologically justified slavery and its afterlife, right, were Christians. And it's still Christians to this day that are defending, fighting against, this is, I think, kind of what Serena is saying. How do we deal with this when it's in our own house, right, in our own kind of families? But yeah, it's absolutely Christians. And so for Christians, one way you think about the protest isn't to effectuate change. It isn't even to participate in rage that may or may not be yours. One reason to go to the protest is just as a form of repentance. To say that we stood on the sidelines. We're absolutely on the wrong side of history. This is the kind of, this is the locale of Jesus's life in the world, is with these folks, and to embody and to inhabit and to receive this rage. So yeah, the church is the ultimate culprit here. But the great tragedy of that is not simply that that's a reality, it clearly is. The great reality is the church is the prolific image of the redeemed creation, right? It's not simply that we're not supposed to be on the wrong side of history, it's that we are supposed to be the destiny of creaturely life, the place where God says, of anywhere on creation, my spirit dwells here. And whatever I'm doing with the rest of the earth, you can see a foretaste of it sacramentally in the life of the church. So that's the great that's a huge tragedy that Christians haven't kind of ponied up and kind of received their own inheritance. So that's why Christians should absolutely be, in the midst of this fight, because it's a fight for their own faithfulness, and it's an expression of their own faithfulness. So yeah, you're right. I think that's the great loss. And the fights for distribution. Distributionism, the movement, is a thoroughly Roman Catholic movement. It's been endorsed by Roman Catholics since, about the 1910, 1920. Famous distributionists are people like C.K. Chesterton. Someone mentioned the Catholic worker Dorothy Day. This has roots in kind of British left-wing Catholic Christianity. So distributionism is fundamentally a Christian idea. So Christians should totally be endorsing this stuff. For Christians, this should be the easy stuff, I would think. It's like, of course, we don't want to have at the cost of other people. I'll send you guys, by the way, a really great talk I heard. Someone sent it to me by Andy Crouch. I don't know if you guys know who that is, but he's kind of a popular evangelical. And it's a talk he gave in San Francisco, I think just a year or two ago, where he has this really great graph that, it's a really great way of describing what privilege is. And privilege is the kind of binary between vulnerability and power. And what privilege is giving up, refusing my vulnerability so that I can have power that makes other people vulnerable. It's a really interesting kind of, and I think helpful way of thinking about it.
I'm having just a hard time knowing what to do, if that makes sense. Like obviously, like going to the protests, it helps cure that immediate emotion of atonement or whatever. But I think most of us like feel this is a systemic issue that needs a systemic response. But I don't want to be another one of those stereotypes, you know, of like I've seen like 3 movies of like these white charities that like think that they're doing a great thing, but they didn't listen to anybody and then just become more of the problem. And so I mean, I feel caught in the middle of saying like, oh, okay, like these are things that we could do to help, and then also like saying like, oh, I shouldn't be giving ideas. So I just want to do something, but I don't know what to do. So I was just curious what you are doing or what you think should be done.
Yeah, I mean, in
Generally.
some ways, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know Orange County's context right now. I mean, I know about the Waco things because my daughter tells me where to go. So it's, you know, so for me, it's trying to figure out where I think things are happening and we as a family need to be. So we try to go. You know, Talia, fortunately, has been to a number of protests and she thinks in those terms. So I think that's good. But there are ways to link into organizers in your community. I mean, it's probably as easy as a Google search. And you can find out what's happening. So much of it is linked in social media. I'm guessing a lot of you guys know already. And there's ways to actually ask those people that question, Luke, and to say, our church is like, you know, this handful of Christians, and we're trying to figure out how to be a part of things. Can you help us? And those people love those kinds of emails. Partly just because they need people to support them, but they may also have things for you guys practically to do. But you know, I think there's, in terms of the larger systemic things, I mean, I cannot articulate this enough to you guys, but you guys have a lot of legal people. It's a really important thing. Like, I don't know any church with the density of legal people as you guys. Just like I don't know of any church with the density of software people as Redeemer. And so they created a software company that redistributes, they make money, they deal with Fortune 500 companies, and they redistribute the income they make from their for-profit business. I don't think that's the particular cachet of what lawyers can do, but they can do a lot. I mean, this is entirely a question about legal matters. And so I would say lean into that. And by that, I mean, what are the connections you guys already have that people are kind of engaged in these questions, right? I think, Michelle, don't you work for the city or the county or something like this? And, you know, a lot of you guys have connections to institutions. Or you, again, you may begin to think, what are the ways that collectively Christ Kaleidoscope can gather its monies and rethink about kind of what you guys are doing as an institution. These take radical forms of commitment, but they also, what's great about them is you do them one step at a time. Right? You don't have to know it's all going to work out. You just have to look around and say, what has God given us? Right? How can we contribute and let it go from there? So. So I mean, don't ignore your legal heritage. I'm looking at all you lawyers right now, including some of whom are not showing their pictures. By the way, I was just thinking the other day about Hung at the retreat. He said to me, I know Hung's hiding out right now. He's just got his black screen. But he said, what if Corona gets much worse? You know, like, I'll have all these difficult questions. And I was thinking, this guy must be high. How much worse can it, you know, it's just like a little virus. And yet here we are, you know, 5 months later and the world's been turned upside down. That's a real doctor for you right there. You guys have other thoughts? Are there protests in Orange County?
We went to one there's been some in Tustin and Santa Ana, Huntington Beach. Yeah, I said we went to one and there's a teenage girl just basically yelling at us at how we benefited from a a racially unjust system, and I just thought it's funny
You
that
guys specifically?
well, like she just sang it to the crowd because I mean there
Oh.
were black people there, but there was a lot of white people, and it was just interesting because people were not offended. They were like, when she was calling them out, they were like cheering and clapping. And it's like a different, it's just like a different um, logic going on at protests, which I just thought was really interesting. I mean, I think this is what like the prophets in the Old Testament were like, they're calling out Israel. And I think that was supposed to be the response, where they kind of recognized their injustice in a way that was invigorating and not simply crushing.
Yeah, I mean, protests are like church services, right? They have their own liturgies, their
Yeah.
own cadences, their own forms of worship, their own kind of modes of logic. I remember years ago, and you always weary because, like, as a Christian or as an Asian American or, you know, as whatever, you always feel like, do I belong here? Well, I'm guessing most people probably think that at some level, except maybe this person that was yelling. I remember years ago, I was at a protest when I was on university staff, and it was also a race protest. And you know, there's like a couple hundred people there. And I just felt like as a Christian, I should say something. But I felt very nervous as a Christian to say something because everyone's thinking, you know, at a university of California, the Christians are to blame, which we are. But I just felt like I just said, I don't know what else to say, but I'm here because I think Jesus would be here. And then at the end, they're like, let's have this brother pray for our protest. You know, I was completely ill prepared for that. But it's just to say that those places have their own, you know, the spirit can be alive in very unique ways. And we don't want to be there mostly because I think we feel vulnerable and out of control. It's not our space. It's not our worship. But, you know, I think that's part of the importance of it. So, you know, bringing your kids there, it's a great idea. Plus, people will harass you less if you have kids, the police, I mean, hopefully.
Chris and Kyrie didn't engage too well with the protests.
Oh, okay.
They kept asking, when is this over? When are we going over?"
Yeah, David was feeling very warm. So, but he also wanted to go. So,
No.
well, I think he did. So,
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on 8:40 here. I know it's getting late over there for you, John, too. Anyone have any other questions or anything they wanted to discuss? Okay. Oh,
I think I probably belabored the point in small group, but I think I just really do want to echo John's point of like, there is a wealth of resources, I think, in our church. And to be able to think, right, like protesting is one thing. I do think like law and public policy are two different spheres. But there is a wealth of resources that is available to us. And I think if we're able to, and if there is interest, I think it would be beholden to us to have a continued conversation of what is Christ Kaleidoscope's role in systems of injustice, and what is our role in correcting that, right? And I think for us to be able to have creativity and imagination to think beyond, well, we live in Irvine, all we can do is donate. I think there's a lot more to be done and said. And I know I'm coming back to the West Coast in a couple of weeks, and so I'm would love to be able to continue the conversation with all of you as well.
thanks, Anthony. I guess a closing question maybe for you, John. I know you closed your piece. You also, we talked about this at the end of retreat about Redeemer, that church opening a school in an under-resourced area. I guess maybe for some people, we may not connect that to like the protests going on. And I don't know if you can just speak to like the connection between that and like um the police shootings and all of that sort of stuff. Like, yeah, I don't know if that question makes sense.
Well, some of my friends said there seems to be a gross disconnect with the penultimate paragraph of this essay and the rest of the essay. Um, right, there's a big debate in contemporary theology, probably for the last 50 years since Hauerwas started getting going, about whether the church, the role of the church is to positively affect and change the world, or whether it's to be the church and offer an alternative to the world, right? So the school would be, you could think about it either way. You could think about it as an alternative political economy constituted by a private church, a church, obviously, a private for-profit company, and the use and redistribution of funds that makes it largely like a privately funded public school. Right, and that would be, here's an alternative economy. But it also has direct effects in the world. It's educating kids who can't get an education otherwise in San Francisco. So I think it's a really hard abstract question about what is the church and its relationship to the world. Are we here to offer a witness to the fact that Christ has changed the world? Are we here to positively change the world ourselves through the work of the Spirit in our lives? Yeah, so there is a kind of disconnect in the thing. I think that's partly because it's an ambiguous question. It's a hard question for Christians. But it may be the case that the particular gifts you have, and I think this is what Anthony is saying, lend itself to a particular way of answering that question, right? Like the gifts you guys are talking about aren't what's often called priestly gifts, gifts specifically of the vocation of the church, right? You have a couple of people who are charged to be your ministers, but the gifts that you guys have are public gifts. They're public skill sets. They're usable. Well, their primary use is actually outside of the church, right? God forbid that there would need to be a lot of lawyers inside the church. So in the same way that Dayspring looked around and realized it had two things, it had teachers and it had tech people. You guys have a lot of lawyers and a lot of places and a lot of people that can engage your neighborhoods and communities otherwise. And I think that answers two questions, both visions of Christian discipleship in the church. It says that this church is a alternative to the world and that we're not going to keep our gifts to ourselves, right? But it also says we're going to positively try to affect the world. Will we change it? Probably not. We're not going to have that kind of pretension, but we're going to try to be faithful with the little things that we have. And we don't have to start out by starting like a private law firm. We could just try to find out who needs qualified legal assistance. Any of you guys have practiced law or freaking watched Law and Order, right? Know that a large reason why a lot of people end up in prison is because the public defender's office can't constitute the kinds of defense most people need. And so think about the legal skills that you guys have. I mean, a lot of you guys have only been lawyers for a few years, but the combined experience, right, and the combined commitment to be able to come along some kid that found himself lost in the criminal justice system and is going to be dependent on a public defender that's got tons and tons of cases, for you guys to say we're gonna do what we can to positively contribute to this case and see how it goes. You may find that you're terrible at it, that you should never ever touch that system again. You may find out that that's actually the telos of why you went to law school, right? You don't know. That's the beautiful thing about it. And at some level, it's pretty low stakes for you. So you might consider something like that. I think that answers both questions. How does the church be an alternative and how does it change the world? And there's lots of you guys that can contribute to that kind of conversation. There's certainly experts in the room that really know how the system works, but there's also others of you that can help think about it or help serve or partner or direct other resources. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a legal moment if there ever was one. I mean, it's so interesting. It's like God is saying to Christ Kaleidoscope, your time is now. for a time such as this, that I put all these lawyers. And I mean, whoever thought God would do such a thing? Put so many lawyers in such a small church. Lawyers marrying lawyers, lawyers going back to law school, second career, lawyers living in the same apartment in Irvine. It's just like, it's like bizonko, it's like bizarro lawyer world. You know, and then others, if you have social competencies and connections to the city, others, you guys have financial resources, right? So you just have all kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, I guess that I wouldn't say difficulty, but I think many of us imagine that everything that's going on right now, we have to we need to directly respond to everything that's going on out in the world. And I guess what you're saying, I don't know if this is what you're saying, but the Redeemer Church example seemed to be more like they weren't necessarily responding to a moment, but they were looking at the gifts that constituted their church, and out of that birthed something that maybe does directly battle racial injustice. Maybe it's not directly battling it, I guess. And yeah, and I guess that's the kind of tension given what's going on. It's you kind of maybe feel like a pressure to have to do something in the moment, and versus kind of like allowing something to bubble up out of what we find God has gifted within the community.
Yeah, the great thing about Redeemers, they have an ongoing work, an ongoing project, right? So they don't feel like here, well, they do feel the pressure should we get involved in the protests, but they're already involved in the city. They're already involved in systems of inequality, right? They, as I said in the piece, they refer to their graduation as a protest movement against George Floyd's death. They graduated the first class of middle school kids. So they already are in that world. So they don't feel the urgency. They're not pressed and pulled. I think there are certain kinds of urgencies you should feel, like you should feel small urgencies in this moment. Like, how are we thinking about participating in the protest? What do we think about what's happening in our country? But God forbid that you would be driven by the forces of the world to determine what your faithfulness looks like for you guys, right? Those questions predate what's happening over the last few months, and thank God for that, because then what will be the driver is the collective wisdom of your community. But one thing you can afford to do you answer the little urgencies and treat them with the attention that they deserve, which is some and not much, something in between. But in terms of the ongoing vocation of Christ's Kaleidoscope, make sure that's taken care of. That doesn't mean you need to do anything now, but make sure that you guys are responsible for what has been given to you. That's the big call of all the questions of resources in the gospel, right? The parable of the talents, which is, you've been given this thing. Don't sit on it too long. Don't jump too quickly also, right? Don't be driven by the urgency of the moment, but also you have been given gifts. And what are the ways you guys can live into those? Like I said, and you don't have to know for sure. You don't have to know like God is calling us to X, Y, and Z, and in 10 years we'll be doing this. It's small steps to decide, is this where God would have us? Yeah, is this what God's doing? Remember, God is extraordinarily gracious and patient. He's gracious with his gifts and patient with us in terms of how we use them, and you can rest in that. But that rest should not be a paralysis. The rest should be a peacefulness about what you can do, knowing that if you fail, it's okay, and it may be something else. I mean, you guys might consider talking to Redeemer at some point.
Yeah.
Like, ask them, when I asked them, like, how did you start Dayspring, the software company? It took years of thinking, just like the church, One of the things I realized, though, about Redeemer, and I think this has got to be true for you guys, is that everything about what they do in the city and all the amazing things they do flows out of one reality. They love to be together. They just love to be together. That they took their common life, everything is an extension of their common life. That's what is the most remarkable to find out about Redeemer. Like, if you ask the kids who grew up in that church, like I interviewed a bunch of kids who grew up in that church, like, what do you think about your church? It's so amazing. You started the school, and you guys redistribute money in these neighborhood, you support local community businesses, and you do this with the city. None of the kids who grew up in that church talk about that. What they talk about is the thing they remember all the time is how much they spent their life together growing up. That's the energy, that's the center of everything they do together. And out of that, they put their mind together and figure out what to do. So let that kind of be the center of what you're doing. That allows whatever you're doing outside the church to be an expression of whatever it is you're doing inside. And it also makes, it's a lot better to do it together. But yeah, you might talk to them. I'm happy to kind of connect you all to them. You already know some of those folks, Ken.
Yeah.
Or several of you guys know those folks. So.
All right. Thank you, John. I think with that, nobody has any other comments or questions.
I'll pray for you guys.
Yeah, would you pray for us, John?
God, thank you for Christ Kaleidoscope's heart, and that they're asking these questions, and that some of them have been your hand and feet in the fight for against injustice, and the fight for equality, and the fight for Black lives. We also confess as Christians that a lot of times we've lived in our privilege and insulated ourselves from the world, and we've benefited from that. But God, you're gracious and patient and long-suffering with us and with the injustices of the world. Help us to be closer to your heart so that we would know what you would have of this particular church and these particular individuals. Thank you for what's happening right now. We pray that your Spirit would enable these extraordinary sets of questions and conversations. And thank you for the extraordinary witness of the Black church as a reminder that you haven't abandoned us. So go forth with my friends, give them great wisdom, great joy to be in being together. Help them to see as you would see what you have for them in this really wonderful moment. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
It was really great to see you guys.